We are conditioned to believe that size equates to security, that vastness is the ultimate shield. But the great, haunting paradox of Russian history is that its staggering geography has always been its greatest vulnerability. Look at a map of the world and your eyes are inevitably drawn to it. A colossal, staggering expanse of land that spans 11 time zones, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. It is the largest country on Earth, a titan among nations. Yet, for all its immense scale, Russia possesses the soul of a besieged fortress. This is not a story of a nation that grew big because it was greedy. It is the story of a culture that grew massive because it was terrified. Historically, the Russian heartland has no natural borders. There are no towering mountain ranges to the west to stop an invader, no deep oceans to buffer it from hostile neighbors. It is a wide-open, flat plain of endless steppe and dense forest, a geographical highway inviting conquerors to try their luck. To survive in such a place, the people realized very early on that they could not afford the luxury of decentralized, messy democracy or individual freedom. You need a monolith. You need an absolute power that can mobilize resources across a continent at a moment's notice. Geography did not just shape the Russian state, it demanded autocracy. This created a culture where the state became a deity, and the citizen became a sacrifice. For centuries, this vast canvas was a sparsely populated wilderness, a mosaic of Slavic tribes, nomadic horsemen, and unforgiving taiga. In the 9th century, a group of Scandinavian Norsemen known as the Rus navigated the intricate network of rivers, the Dnieper, the Volga, the Don, that served as the superhighways of the ancient world. They did not come to conquer so much as to trade, merging with the local Slavic populations to form Kievan Rus. This was a prosperous, fragmented federation of princely states, heavily influenced by the cultural and religious weight of the Byzantine Empire to the south. In the year 988, Prince Vladimir of Kiev made a calculation that would echo through the millennia. Legend says he inspected the great religions of the world and chose Orthodox Christianity, allegedly rejecting Islam because of its ban on alcohol, famously remarking that drinking is the joy of the Rus. It is a charming anecdote, but the reality was pure geopolitics. By aligning with Constantinople, Vladimir tethered his young nation to European culture, literacy, and high civilization. For a brief moment, it looked as though Russia would evolve along a familiar European trajectory, a land of trading cities, growing literacy, and artistic achievement. It was a golden age of cathedral building and lawmaking, where women held property rights and the prince was first among equals rather than a god among men. But everything they had built, every brick of that nascent European civilization, was about to be systematically erased by a storm from the east that nobody saw coming. In 1237, the horizon across the Russian steppe turned black. The Mongols had arrived. This was not a mere military defeat, it was a total civilizational lobotomy. The horse lords of Genghis Khan's descendants did not just conquer the Russian principalities, they pulverized them. Kiev, once one of the largest and most beautiful cities in Europe, was burned to the ground. The chroniclers wrote that no eye remained open to weep for the dead. For the next 2.5 centuries, the Russian lands were forced into a state of arrested development, cut off from the European Renaissance, the birth of modern commerce, and the concept of humanism. This period, known as the Mongol yoke, rewired the psychological and political DNA of the Russian people forever. To survive under the Khan, you learn to be brutal, you learn to be subservient, and above all, you learn that power is absolute. The princes of a minor, swampy trading post called Moscow proved exceptionally good at this dark game. They became the tax collectors for the Mongols, ruthlessly squeezing their fellow Slavs to please their overlords. Imagine a peasant in the year 1300. Daily life was not just a battle against the bitter, freezing winters. It was a continuous existence in a state of terror. Your crops belonged to your lord belonged to the Grand Prince of Moscow, and the Grand Prince belonged to the Khan. There was no concept of individual rights, only duty and survival. The state became the sole source of life and death. By the time the Mongol grip finally weakened in the late 15th century, Moscow had eaten its neighbors and stood as the undisputed master of the Russian lands. It was here that the modern Russian state was truly born, forged in the fires of foreign oppression and internal ruthlessness. In 1547, a young, deeply paranoid ruler named Ivan IV crowned himself not as Grand Prince, but as Tsar, a Russian rendering of Caesar. History remembers him as Ivan the Terrible, but a more accurate translation of his moniker is Ivan the Awesome or Ivan the Inspiring of Dread. Ivan looked out at the map and realized the terrifying reality of his inheritance. To protect Moscow from future invasions, Russia could not just sit still on its flat, indefensible plains. It had to expand until it hit natural barriers, the Ural Mountains, the Arctic Ocean, the Caspian Sea. And so began a relentless, centuries-long drive outward, expanding at a rate of 50 square miles a day for hundreds of years. In doing so, Russia became an empire before it even had time to become a unified nation. This created a profound identity crisis that has never been resolved. Was Russia a European nation, an Asian empire, or something entirely unique and apart from both? Ivan solved the internal question by creating a state of total, unyielding autocracy, crushing the old nobility, and creating a secret police force to exterminate any hint of dissent. The message was clear: the state was everything, and the individual was nothing. The pivot from this medieval, isolated kingdom to a global superpower required another monster of a ruler, and he arrived in the form of Peter the Great at the turn of the 18th century. Peter looked at his giant, bearded, deeply superstitious kingdom and felt a profound sense of shame. While Europe was undergoing the scientific revolution, building navies, and colonizing the globe, Russia was effectively still stuck in the Middle Ages. Peter's solution was as radical as it was brutal. He would drag Russia into the modern Western world kicking and screaming. He forced his nobles to shave their traditional beards, adopted Western dress, and built a navy from scratch. To give Russia a window to the West, he ordered the construction of a brand new capital on the freezing, swampy shores of the Baltic Sea. They called it St. Petersburg. But look closely at the beautiful, European-style palaces of that city, and you are looking at a monument to human suffering. It was built on the bones of an estimated 100,000 conscripted serfs who died of disease, exhaustion, and exposure in the mud. This was the tragic irony of Peter and Apos' reforms. He wanted to westernize Russia, to bring it the fruits of European enlightenment, but he used the most brutal, despotic methods imaginable to achieve it. Russia was now a major European power, but it remained a nation of masters and slaves. This tension between a brilliant, highly educated elite and a massive, impoverished, enslaved peasantry created a pressure cooker that would eventually explode. But before it did, Russia had to face the ultimate test of its geography and its resolve. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte, the master of Europe, marched his grand army of over 600,000 men into the Russian heartland. On paper, Russia should have stood no chance against the greatest military mind of the age. But the Russians understood something Napoleon did not: the infinite depth of their own land. Zoom out on the map, and you see the French army advancing deeper and deeper into a void. Zoom in on a single Russian family in the path of the invasion, and you see them deliberately setting fire to their own home, their own crops, and their own livestock. They retreated, leaving Napoleon nothing but scorched earth and ashes. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow, he found a deserted city that was promptly set ablaze by its own inhabitants. The French emperor waited for a surrender that never came, while the Russian winter began to settle in. The retreat of the Grand Army through the snows of Russia is one of history and Apos' greatest tragedies. Of the 600,000 men who entered, fewer than 100,000 returned. Russia had defeated the greatest conqueror in the world, not by outsmarting him on the battlefield, but by weaponizing its own brutal climate and the infinite patience of its suffering people. Yet, this magnificent victory only delayed the inevitable reckoning. Throughout the 19th century, as the rest of Europe industrialized and moved toward democracy, the Romanov Tsars doubled down on autocracy, ignoring the desperate need for reform. The abolition of serfdom in 1861 came too late and was handled too poorly to appease the growing fury of the masses. By the time the 20th century dawned, the Russian Empire was a giant with feet of clay. The match that lit the fuse was the First World War. The Russian army, poorly equipped and led by incompetent aristocrats, was slaughtered on an industrial scale. By 1917, the population had had enough. Bread riots in St. Petersburg turned into a full-scale revolution. The Tsar abdicated, and a few months later, a small, highly disciplined group of radical Marxists known as the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power. They promised peace, land, and bread. What they delivered was a civil war of unimaginable savagery, followed by the creation of the world's first communist state, the Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks claimed they were breaking with the dark, autocratic past of the Tsars, but in reality, they merely perfected it. They took the paranoia, the secret police, and the absolute centralization of Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great and supercharged them with the power of industrial technology and totalitarian ideology. Under Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union underwent a forced industrialization that was even more brutal than Peter the Great and Apo's reforms. Millions of peasants were forced onto collective farms, leading to a man-made famine that killed millions in Ukraine and southern Russia. Millions more were sent to the Gulag, a vast network of forced labor camps, or simply shot in the back of the head by the secret police. Yet, this brutal, industrialized state was what saved the nation when the ultimate darkness arrived in 1941. Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union with the explicit goal of exterminating or enslaving the Slavic population. What the Russians called the Great Patriotic War was a conflict of a scale and brutality that defies human comprehension. At the Battle of Stalingrad, the average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier thrown into the meat grinder was less than 24 hours. Zoom into a mother hiding in a frozen cellar, clutching a starving child while artillery rains down around them, and you see the true cost of this conflict. Zoom out, and you realize that the Soviet Union lost 27 million people in that war. Every single family in the country had a ghost at the dinner table. It was the Soviet Union, at a cost of blood that no Western nation could have or would have paid, that broke the back of the Nazi war machine. In the aftermath of the war, the Soviet Union emerged as a global superpower, locked in a tense, decades-long Cold War with the United States. This was a surreal era where Russia possessed the power to destroy the world with the push of a button, yet its own citizens had to stand in line for hours just to buy a loaf of bread or a pair of shoes. The Kremlin projected an image of unstoppable communist perfection, launching the first satellite and the first human being into space, while internally the system was rotting from the inside out. For the average Soviet citizen in the 1970s and 80s, life was a study in profound irony. You lived in a superpower that controlled half the globe, but you lived in a cramped, gray apartment, reading heavily censored newspapers and pretending to believe in a utopian future that everyone knew was a lie. The state spent its vast wealth on nuclear submarines and proxy wars in far-flung corners of the earth, while failing to provide its people with the most basic consumer goods. It was a giant with nuclear teeth and a hollow stomach. When the collapse finally came in 1991, it did not happen because of a foreign invasion, but because the system simply ran out of energy, belief, and economic viability. The Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin on a cold December night, and the largest empire on Earth dissolved overnight without a shot being fired, leaving 15 independent nations in its wake and plunging millions into an identity crisis. The 1990s were a period of intense humiliation, poverty, and absolute chaos for the Russian people. It was a time when life expectancy plummeted, the social safety net vanished, and the immense wealth of the nation was looted by a handful of corrupt oligarchs while ordinary citizens sold their household belongings on street corners just to eat. Imagine being a proud citizen of a global superpower one day, and the next, finding your savings worthless and your country a laughingstock. This profound trauma is the missing piece of the puzzle required to understand the modern nation-state we see today. Russia has spent the last quarter-century trying to recover from that psychological collapse by reverting to its ancient, familiar settings. Once again, a strongman sits in the Kremlin, viewing the world outside with deep suspicion. Once again, the state has prioritized control, stability, and geopolitical expansion over individual liberty. Once again, the flat, open plains of its borders are viewed not as lines of peaceful contact, but as potential avenues of invasion that must be secured at all costs, leading to modern conflicts that shock the world. We are left looking at a nation trapped in a tragic, eternal loop dictated by its own geography and the deep, unhealed scars of its past. Russia remains the ultimate paradox, a land of sublime art, brilliant science, and profound human resilience, perpetually governed by the iron fist of autocracy because it believes that without that fist, it would cease to exist. It forces us to ask a haunting, uncomfortable question about the nature of human history. Are some nations truly free to choose their own destiny, or are they forever doomed to repeat the tragedies inscribed upon the very soil they inhabit?